change in real disposable income, which is the gold line. In addition, using on the right-hand side axis, we've also plotted household net worth, which is essentially showing net worth as a multiple of income. And what we observed during the first quarter was a slowing. And this was a little bit surprising to us because the fundamentals actually seem to be suggesting or would be supportive of somewhat higher growth. And as you can see from the graph here, real disposable income growth has been sort of strong, and household net worth is sort of at fairly high levels. So this raises the question, what was behind the slowdown that took place in Q1? And one explanation that's been offered up is that perhaps there's been a change in savings behavior on the part of consumers. Perhaps there's been an increase in precautionary saving. Perhaps this is a change in savings due to demographics. Perhaps consumers are recognizing now with lower interest rates they simply have to save more for retirement. But on the other hand, we also noted that in April there were very strong auto sale release sales and also retail sales. So it's very likely that Q1 was simply just a sort of transitory passing. What I'd like to do now is move on to the manufacturing sector. And what I've done here is there are two series. The first series, plotted on the left-hand side, is the 12-month growth rate of manufacturing. And then on the right-hand side, I plotted for you the ISM Manufacturing Index. The blue line, which is manufacturing, is sort of hard data, whereas the red line is sort of the survey, and both are trying to give a read of manufacturing activity. If you look at the series, you can see that starting at the end of 2014, manufacturing was hit very hard. This was a combination of a strong dollar as well as low oil prices. And recently, the hard data had been suggesting that the manufacturing sector was continuing to contract. Now, more recently, what we observed was the survey index actually rising and being above 50, which is typically indicative of expansion in the manufacturing sector. And until Tuesday's release, the hard data itself was giving a somewhat contradictory signal of contraction. However, on Tuesday we had a release that actually showed manufacturing activity picked up and increased by 0.3%, reversed the decline that took place in March. And so we're taking this as tentative evidence to indeed suggest that perhaps the manufacturing sector is in fact stabilizing. Now, another interesting development has been that for the past 3 quarters, investment in non-residential structures has actually been declining. So what I've plotted here in blue is the total expenditure component, which is investment in non-residential structures. And you can see that the blue line has actually been negative for the last 3 quarters. So the question to ask is, what lies behind this? And it turns out that it is in fact reflecting the very strong contraction in gas and oil drilling activity. And that's shown by the red line, which is the subcomponent which focuses on gas and drilling activity. And the takeaway from this is that, first of all, by looking at the red line, you can see the actual magnitude and severity of the contraction that's taken place because of low oil prices and the pullback that's taken place. And even though the sector dealing with gas and oil drilling activity is only 8% of the total of investment in non-residential structures, the magnitude of that decline is enough to actually be responsible for the decline. If you were to look at investment in non-residential structures and somehow remove oil and gas drilling activity from it, you'd actually see fairly healthy and robust growth taking place. And our last chart that I'd like to focus on is turning to the inflation side, core CPI inflation. And that's the gold line, and I plotted the 12-month % change here. And so core CPI inflation receives a lot of attention because core inflation is typically used as a gauge of underlying inflation, and also provides information on where we believe inflation will be moving in the future. But what I really want to focus on is that there are 2 components that go into core CPI inflation. There's a services component, which is about 70%, receives a weight of about 75%, and goods, which is about 25%. And there's a marked divergence in the pattern of the subcomponents. That is to say that if you take 75% of the red line and 25% of the blue line, then you get the gold line. And so when trying to assess where core inflation is going, what I'm hoping to point out from this particular graph is that it's very important to have a view of where you think services is moving and where goods prices are moving. What comes out from disaggregating total core CPI inflation into its subcomponents is you can see that actual services inflation, which includes things like housing, medical care, has actually been fairly firm and steady, and is now a little bit around 3% at an annual, on a 12-month change basis. Core goods, though, that include things like housewares, apparel, tobacco, are actually, the prices of these items are actually declining. That is to say that they're actually experiencing deflation, and that this is not a new phenomenon. They've actually been declining since about 2013. And these declines in core goods prices are actually acting on a restraint for overall core inflation. So in conclusion, as President Dudley noted, the conduct of monetary policy is data dependent, and so it is critical for the public to not only understand what we mean by this, but also to understand the realm of data that we look at and why. The Snapshot offers a tool to help guide the public in this particular endeavor. My last point is, if you look at the bottom panel, there's more information on when and where to find the snapshot. The one point I would really like to emphasize is the third point, is that we started a couple months ago to actually provide the data for some of the charts so that you can actually go in and recreate the charts if you'd like to, and then disseminate it among, pass them along. So with that, I'll conclude and say thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, so now we're going to turn to your questions, which I'm sure you all have. As a matter of housekeeping, please speak your questions directly into the microphones in front of you. There's one on each table, so pass them around as needed. Before starting your question, please provide your name and affiliation. And as a reminder, we would like, to the extent possible, keep this on topic for today. So with that in mind, who has a question? Mike?
Hi, Mike Derby from the Wall Street Journal. Over the last few days, financial market expectations seem to have grown more open to the idea of a June rate rise. Wanted to get your assessment of whether or not you feel markets are converging in on the expected path of the Fed, and how you are feeling about the June FOMC meeting.
Well, yeah, to reiterate what some of my colleagues have said, is June is definitely a live meeting, but obviously what we do depends on how the economy is going to evolve. And looking at the market expectations, I think it looks like June is roughly 1 and 3, and a tightening through the July meeting looks like about 60% if you look at the federal funds futures markets. You know, I don't know if that's the right, precisely the right probability. I'd have to go around and talk to all my colleagues. But clearly, looking back a few days ago, I think there was a pretty strong sense among FOMC membership, and you could see it in their commentary, that the market was not putting in a sufficient probability mass on the notion of tightening in either the June or July meeting. And so I'm actually quite pleased to see that probability has, in fact, moved up. As I said in an interview with the New York Times about a week and a half ago, I thought that the median projection for the federal funds rate path that was in the March SEP, Summary of Economic Projections, which showed 2 tightenings in 2016, was a reasonable expectation, recognizing, of course, that it does depend on the data, and the data will ultimately drive what we actually do when we arrive at future FOMC meetings.
So I want to follow the rules, which is to keep to the topic here. Given what Robert said about the outlook for the economy, do you think, is it your expectation that the criteria will be in place for a June rate hike? Will the economy have improved by much? Is that your expectation? And how much does Brexit play into that?
Well, I think that if the economy evolves in line with my expectations, so economy that grows above trend, continues to put downward pressure on the unemployment rate, and leads to further tightening of the labor market, and causes us to become more confident over time that inflation is going to return towards our 2% objective, then I think that those are the sort of conditions that you need to see in place for the Federal Reserve to tighten monetary policy further. If I get, if I'm convinced that my own forecast is sort of on track, then I think a tightening in the summer, the June-July timeframe is a reasonable expectation. So it's really a question of whether the economy sort of cooperates and performs in line with my personal expectations. In terms of the Brexit issue, I mean, obviously that's another variable in the mix. The meeting concludes a week before the Brexit vote. And so, you know, there's a possibility there's a possibility of a event a week later that could potentially have consequences for financial market conditions. And so we'll have to think about that in terms of waiting, whether it makes sense to go in June or wait a little bit later. My own view on Brexit is that, you know, it's really thinking about Brexit, I wouldn't want to say that it's determinative that, you know, whether you go or wait. I would say it depends a bit on the probability of adverse vote in the UK. In other words, a leave vote. What's our assessment of the likelihood of that? Number two, what our assessment is of the likely impact on financial conditions if there was such a vote. And three, viewing that in the context of how strong the economy looks at the time. So I don't think I don't think I can give you a sort of straight answer and saying, well, Brexit will either determine or not determine. I think it's much more nuanced than that, because it really depends on all three of these factors.
So I just have to follow up, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The specific question, Bill, was about, do you think the economy will be in the sort of shape that you're looking for, given what your forecast is? And I just want to be clear about the question.
I think that my forecast of the economy is an economy that grows above trend and leads to further tightening of the labor market. And if I'm comfortable that that's evolving, and that, you know, that's a confidence level does matter, right? I mean, you could have an economy that you think is evolving in line with your forecast, but not very much confidence about that, and so that would affect your willingness to move forward. So it's not just about is the economy evolving in line with the forecast, but how confident are you about that that's going to continue in the future? I mean, I think in some ways, you know, it's important to emphasize it's not just how the economic data comes in, but how that economic data then influences your expectations about the future outlook. So, you know, data that affects the outlook is really what matters, not just the fact that we're looking backward at what's actually happened in the past.
Matt?
Hi, Matthew Bosler, Bloomberg. So could you talk a little bit about how you're looking at the slowdown in Q1 and sort of the tentative signs of a rebound in Q2, what you expect there?
Well, I have been expecting the second quarter to be firmer than the first quarter, and based on, you know, pretty limited set of data so far, I mean, it does seem like the second quarter is shaping up to be stronger than the first quarter. I think the consensus viewed right now in terms of the second quarter is that we're going to see growth, you know, 2% plus real GDP growth, recognizing, of course, that could change quite a bit as we get deeper into the quarter and get additional economic information. I think the first quarter slowdown was a little bit surprising in the sense that, especially the weakness in consumer spending. Going into the first quarter, we had strong payroll employment growth. We had very sturdy growth in real disposable income, yet consumption was pretty soft in the first quarter. And I don't think we had a really good explanation for that. And typically when you see data that doesn't fit what you anticipate, and you don't have a good explanation for it, even ex post, you want to probably discount that information a little bit. So the expectation is that the second quarter will be firmer. The retail sales report, the most recent retail sales report, very much supports that expectation, especially in terms of consumer spending. Not only was the most recent month for retail sales stronger than expected, but there were also meaningful upward revisions for the prior couple of months. So it certainly looks like consumer spending is on a much sturdier trajectory in the second quarter compared to the first quarter.
Patrick Osby with CNN. President Dudley, could you explain, it seemed like earlier in the year, the biggest concerns were China, oil prices of emerging markets. Now it seems like Brexit fears have risen, as we were just speaking. How do you sort of, I'm sure you don't rank them 1, 2, and 3, but how do you sort of think about, in the context of those fears that we had earlier this year, Brexit, where do they sort of play high or low on you?
I don't think the Brexit fears have increased. I think all that's happened is that the event is drawn closer to hand, and so it's more relevant in terms of the timing of the potential timing of a monetary policy decision. I mean, what's unusual about the Brexit vote is that, you know, on a certain day, you will find out what happens with certainty. All the other issues that you mentioned are not things that are really are not things that get resolved sort of definitively on any particular day. I think that generally some of the concerns that were causing markets to behave very poorly in January and early February Some of those concerns have subsided. Number one, oil prices have recovered to a degree. Number two, I think China, people are more comfortable with the Chinese currency regime and how they're communicating and how they're going to move their currency, adjust their currency over time. So I think that some of the concerns have abated a bit, but that's not to say that they're gone, and it's not to say that those concerns couldn't come back in the future. So I wouldn't want to say that all those concerns are completely put to bed.
Next question. Matt, another one.
So already in the last few days, as the probabilities of interest rate hikes have crept up, we've started to see a little more volatility in financial markets. How do you deal with that endogeneity problem that's specific to Fed policy expectations?
Well, obviously, one reason why you are tightening monetary policy, when you tighten monetary policy, is you're trying to actually tighten financial conditions a bit, right? Because the whole reason for tightening monetary policy is because you're on a path that you think is unsustainable. In other words, you have a labor market that's improving at a rate that you're going to eventually go through the unemployment rate consistent with full employment, and that's going to put upward pressure on wages and eventually put upward pressure on prices. And you want that to happen, but you don't want it to happen too powerfully, too much. So when you think about normalization of monetary policy, yeah, some tightening of financial conditions is completely appropriate. That's sort of the purpose of tightening monetary policy. The tricky part is that when you pull the monetary policy lever, there's quite a bit of uncertainty about how much financial market tightening that will actually generate. So, when you look back at the December FOMC decision to begin to normalize interest rates, first couple of weeks, financial conditions didn't really react at all. And then when we got into the new year, for a whole host of reasons, in which I would argue that the monetary policy decision was probably well down the list, then we saw a pretty significant tightening of financial conditions. So clearly, how financial conditions evolve, and I've said this many, many times in speeches, how financial conditions evolve does affect the stance of monetary policy. At the end of the day, monetary policy works through financial conditions. So when we're setting monetary policy, we're trying to set a monetary policy that generates a set of financial conditions that generate a growth path consistent with best achieving our objectives with respect to employment and inflation. So financial conditions absolutely do matter, and if they were to not tighten at all, we'd probably ultimately be for any given set of economic conditions. If they weren't tighten at all, and we thought that it was appropriate for financial conditions to tighten, that would probably mean we'd have to do more in terms of monetary policy, and vice versa. If financial conditions tightened a lot in response to a small movement in interest rates, that would probably cause us to go a bit slower. And so that's definitely a factor that we're going to have to take into consideration in terms of how we conduct monetary policy.
Next question.
Oh, hi there, Lindsay Dunsmuir with Reuters. Does the Fed risk losing credibility now if you don't raise rates in June or July, given the fact that you did feature so prominently the prospect of a June rate hike in yesterday's meeting minutes?
I don't think we lose credibility at all if the economic data doesn't justify or motivate the reasons for tightening monetary policy. So, at the end of the day, it's all about whether the data evolves in line with the expectations. If the data doesn't evolve in line with expectations, then we're going to follow the data, and that's going to drive, and how that data affects our outlook, and that's what's going to drive the monetary policy decision. Now, I think the reason why I think a number of Fed speakers have commented that the market expectations were for June and July were too low was the fact that based on their expectation, but based on the data that they've seen and how they expect the future information to evolve, that their assessment is that the probability of tightening, that we're more likely to get a set of economic information consistent with tightening in June and July than what the market was priced to. A few days ago, I think the probability of a June tightening was in low single digits, and that seemed, I think that broadly seemed way too low given the fact that the economy looks like it's growing above trend, and inflation stabilizing, labor market's tightening, and so seems like we're on track to satisfy a lot of the conditions that we would need to see to actually continue the monetary policy tightening process.
Next question. Patrick again.
I'd like to ask about the Labor Department's overtime regs. Some labor experts have said it'll lead to reduced hours. Employers will want to keep employees on, but it'll also have an offsetting effect of maybe higher payrolls. So maybe perhaps higher payrolls, less hours. Do you see it as a net positive or net negative?
I haven't dived into it enough to give you a well-informed answer, so I think I'll have to pass on that.
Trying to stay back on topic. Claudia? Oh, sorry, Steve. Next time.
Hi there, Claudia Hirsch with Market News. I just wanted to clarify, or you to clarify some of the remarks at the top of the press conference here. Did you say, did I hear correctly, that you're placing 1 in 3 odds?
I'm not saying what I'm placing. I'm saying what the
Market
is-
expectations.
What market expectations seem to imply.
Got it.
So if you look at the federal funds futures market, that seems to be what's roughly 30%, 1 in 3 for June, and roughly another 30% or so for July. So 60% cumulative probability through July, roughly. Looks like. Obviously, every tick in the federal funds future markets has, sizable effects on those probabilities. So I wouldn't take that literally, because it could, it'll change as we go through, the coming days and weeks. But definitely higher, much higher than what we were a few days ago.
Thank you so much.
Steve?
Yeah, well, this completely violates the rules.
It was
But we
bounced.
have, there was a massive fraud from accounts at the New York Federal Reserve Bank in February, and we haven't had a chance to ask you about this publicly. Understood that this did not occur over systems that were controlled by the New York Federal Reserve Bank, but could you tell us whether or not changes have been made at the New York Fed, and whether or not money now at this moment is safer than it was previously before the fraud?
Well, I can tell you that, well, first of all, just to reiterate what the sort of facts of the situation were, there was not any evidence at all of any attempt to try to penetrate the Federal Reserve systems in connection with the Bangladesh situation, and there's no evidence that any Fed systems were in fact compromised. But that said, we need to continue to assess our internal control environment, because as we see from these episodes, the threat environment is always changing, and so we always have to ask ourselves the question: are we doing all the things that we can do to make sure that our systems are as safe as possible? And of course, we're doing that.
Next question. Mike?
This is semi-on topic. The New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations and the inflation expectations readings that have been in that survey. What's your sense of them now? I know they have been on a long-term kind of grind lower. You've been a little bit worried about that in the past. Do you feel better on that front?
I think, just talking about inflation expectations more broadly, not just focusing on the survey of consumer expectations. I think that the two things. I mean, number one, while there was some decline earlier, the declines were not of large magnitudes, and so I still felt that it was worth paying attention to, because if the declines were to continue, then I think it would have caused me to become concerned. So it was sort of on my radar screen as something that I was paying attention to. And recently, it looks like we've actually had a little stability. And if you look at the University of Michigan most recent 5-year inflation expectations, it actually ticked up a little bit. So I think that generally on the inflation front, I'm becoming more confident that inflation is likely to return back to our 2% objective. Namely, if you look at core inflation in particular, it's been pretty stable over the last year, despite the weakness in energy prices, despite the strength of the dollar. And the strength of the dollar and the weakness in energy prices seems to be, at least for now, ending. And so the fact that core inflation was pretty flat over that period, even though you had some factors that you would have expected was pushing it lower, I think it should make you a little bit more confident that inflation is likely make you more confident inflation is likely to return over the medium term towards our 2% objective. Also, I think if you look at the labor market data really closely, maybe you can see the signs of a little bit of an uptick in wage inflation pressure. So that's also consistent with the notion that we're getting closer to full employment. So in general, I think I'm pretty confident that we're going to get back to 2% as long as the economy continues to grow at a somewhat above trend pace that leads to further tightening in the labor market. So to me, the bigger uncertainty in my mind is what's the growth rate going to be, and how's that's going to translate in terms of pressure on resources. And as long as that materializes, then I'm pretty confident that we'll get back to 2% inflation.
Further questions?
So two-part question, one for each side of the mandate. So the unemployment rate, I think a year ago, a lot of people were concerned that, it would just keep dropping like a rock, and it's sort of stabilized over the last 7 months around 5%. So what do you make of that, especially in the context of labor market tightening? And then on the inflation side, it looks like the last few months we had core PCE at 1.7% in February, 1.6% in March, and now analysts are saying after the CPI release that we'll probably get 1.5% in April. So how do you look at that inflation trend? Is that going to give you confidence in the near term?
Well, I think that let's do the inflation first. The core PCE deflator on a year-over-year basis has been bouncing around a little bit, but it ticked up a little bit in the first quarter. It looks like it's going to tick back down a little bit in the second quarter, and I would view that as mostly noise. I wouldn't take a lot of signal from that. I think it's broadly been stable. That's how I sort of think about it. In terms of the unemployment rate being stable at 5%, even though the employment gains have still been pretty sturdy over the last 6 months or so, I think it's really good news, because what it basically is, what's happening is that the labor force participation rate is picking up. People who were discouraged workers are coming back into the labor force, and I think that's a really good development. It's good for them, and it's good for the economy, because it means that the productive capacity of the economy is a little bit bigger as a consequence of those people being willing to be part of the labor force. So I think if anything, it basically tells you have a little bit more room to grow, because it's telling you that there's actually a little bit more slack in the labor market than you thought, because it's not just the people who were in the labor market 6 months ago, it's also the people who have now come back into the labor market over that subsequent period. So I think it's really, really good news, frankly.
Any final questions? Last one, before we get into the fourth round.
Andrew Levin recently released a reform proposal for the Federal Reserve, and one of the things in there was making the regional Fed Reserve banks explicitly part of the government, sort of ending that quasi-private status. Do you support that, or see it as important in any fashion a reform like that?
Look, I think that the important thing in terms of talking about Federal Reserve reform is that the reform actually make the Federal Reserve perform better, and I think the current arrangements are actually working quite well, both in terms of preserving the Federal Reserve's independence with respect to the conduct of monetary policy, and actually leading to pretty successful outcomes in terms of our ability to achieve our dual mandate objectives. So, my first thing would be to whoever contemplates reform is to do no harm. I gave a speech at the Virginia Military Institute about a month ago, and I talked at length about the issue of the Federal Reserve reform and why the Federal Reserve why this is a topic of great discussion. And if you look at the Federal Reserve's history, there's been a lot of debate about what the appropriate structure for the Federal Reserve has been since the beginning of the Federal Reserve System back in 1913. And the Federal Reserve is set up in sort of a federalist structure, so that there is not too much power concentrated in Washington, or for that matter, in New York, which is the financial center of the country. And I would argue that this setup has served the country quite well.
Next, hopefully on topic question. Steve Leisman.
You doubt me?
Don't be offended.
I'm never offended. So my question has to do with the minutes that came out yesterday, in which you said that if the economy improves as expected, I guess that you would likely raise rates in June. However, the April statement gave the markets the impression that the chance of a June rate hike was less. Yields fell, the probability of a rate hike in June fell. Do you have a communication problem? Was that a mistake not to tell markets about your leanings and your sense of June in the statement that came out in April?
I don't have a view about, obviously, communications is, we're never perfect. We never know exactly how people are gonna take the words that we use. So there's always a little bit of a issue of translation. That said, I think we've been pretty clear in recent weeks that, further tightening is likely this year. And, through a wide range of Fed speakers. So I'm a little surprised that, I think even prior to the release of the FOMC minutes, I think speaking for myself, I was surprised that the market wasn't taking more signal from what Fed speakers were actually saying. Now, obviously, there's a couple reasons why that might be. Number one, the market expectations about how the economy is going to evolve could be different than that of Fed officials, or there could be a concern that monetary policy tightening might be difficult to do because an expectation that somehow it would lead to an outsized tightening of financial market conditions. I think our own view is that if the economy, as we said, as the minutes make clear, is if the economy evolves in line with expectations, it will be appropriate to tighten monetary policy further, and that's what we would expect reasonably to do.
Any last questions? All right, well, our last question, officially.
Okay, thank you. Again, Lindsay Dunsmuir with Reuters. I just want to ask you, there did seem to be a slight disconnect in the minutes between the view of voters and non-voters. Do you feel that everybody has the same opinion of June, or do you think that voters are possibly a little bit more dovish on that?
I think there's probably, like there is most FOMC readings, I think there's probably a range of opinions about exactly what the timing, what is the precise timing of when it would be appropriate to move policy again. But my general sense is that the range of views among Fed officials is relatively narrow in the current environment relative to past periods. So I don't see that there's a huge gap in views. But there's always going to be a question about the precise timing of the next move, especially in an environment where the economy, while the economy may be growing above trend, it's not growing above trend by a significant margin. I think if the economy were putting in a 4% second quarter GDP, and we're all very aware of that and thought that was going to continue, then I think there'd be a very, very strong consensus in terms of what to do next. But when the economy is growing just marginally above trend, then I think it's it's people who have slight differences in the outlook, or weigh the risks to the outlook a little differently, might reach somewhat different opinions about the precise timing of interest rates. But you look at the summary of economic projections, and you look at all the forecasts, they're all moving in an upward direction. So I think that tells you that the committee is pretty much of the same view, that monetary policy tightening is expected to continue over incoming quarters.
And with that, we'll call it. As always, we're available for further questions separately and offline. Thank you to President Dudley and Rob Rich for the presentation, and have a good day.